send you home. And so you've taken in so many talks already, you probably have tons of notes and your mind is swirling. And so I promise this will be the last one before we go home and have fun and sleep and enjoy the world and watch. Well, I'm a Seahawks fan, so Portland doesn't have sports teams, so we have to go outside of Portland to find them except for the Trailblazers. So anyways, that's not really the topic. Here we go. I want to, these are the questions that are up there, and you'll get them at the end again, but I want to close out the Sermon on the Mount, acknowledging that, again, I said this in my first talk, the way that the Sermon on the Mount began is how the Sermon on the Mount is going to end. So it's going to be connected. It's not just that Jesus is throwing all these little sayings throughout the entire sermon, and they're all disconnected. Everything flows together. Everything is going to ultimately make sense. And so what I want to show is that our talks were not disconnected, but they were actually a part of what Jesus was trying to communicate the whole time, right? So those are the questions. I'll go back and we can reevaluate that. Before, I did say that I would share a little bit more about who I was, and so I am married to Julia. She's our director of worship right now at Hope. I love her a lot. She's amazing. We met in Virginia. I did all 3 years of LDI here, and then I left in August of 2018 to go pastor a church in Virginia and had the joy and honor of doing that for a little under a year. And then we decided to move while we were engaged back to Minnesota, and then we got married in October, and now she's the director of worship. And so she's currently right now probably leading worship at Hope. So would have loved to have her here, but that's okay. And that's all you need to know about me and about us. She's far more fascinating than I am, so please talk to her. The 5 things I want to draw us to. So we're going to conclude. We're going to wrap up the sermon. But to do that, I want to bring forward 5 things to keep fresh in our mind. Right? We've gone through the whole sermon. I want to keep just 5 things to keep our contemporary minds, keeping 1 foot in the ancient world and 1 foot where we are right now. So these are just quick little things to help orient our hearts and our minds around the rest of the sermon. So just 5 quick things to keep in mind. Number 1 is that Jesus called his disciples just before he ascended to the mountain. Okay? So we've already talked about this. He's talking to his disciples. He's giving them what would be kind of the ethic or the outline of what the new kingdom is going to look like in him. Right? So Jesus has just called his disciples before he ascends, and we're going to see how that plays out at the end. Next, Jesus reenacts the Mosaic or Sinai, which is a fancy way of saying when they went up on Mount Sinai, the moment in Israel's history by posturing himself as the quote-unquote new Moses. The Jewish mind would have seen Jesus acting as a quote-unquote prophet like Moses, ascending onto the side of a mountain, sitting down, and then talking and speaking and giving the outline of what the new people of God was to look like. Moses goes up to the mountain, gets the commands from God, comes down, and then talks to the people about what the new covenant people of God would look like. It's the exact same parallel. And actually, if you the next one that even goes with it, the 10 speech patterns of the sermon actually mimic the 10 commands or covenant ethics that are given at Sinai. In the Greek, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, our chapter breaks in the English Bibles don't quite get at it, but I was showing some people that there are actually definitive breaks in the Greek text that actually map out 10 sections of speech that Jesus gives to the people on the mountain. And each one of those actually, it's not like a perfect parallel with each of the different commandments, but the idea is that there are 10 speech acts that are given to the people. And this idea of 10 represents completeness or fullness, right? You've seen or heard that 7 is also a number of completeness, or 3 is a number of completeness. 10 is also a number of completeness. Jesus is giving us an ethic for what the kingdom looks like. And the 4th thing to keep in mind, the Semitic mind, the Jewish mind, the Middle Eastern mind, operates typically in 2s. And so you'll see Jesus start to talk about the 2 different gates, 2 different trees, 2 different houses. And the idea here is that he's trying to draw your imagination into the story, into what he's trying to tell you to help you identify with one of the 2. Because you'll see that there's not a 3rd option. Almost across the board, no commentator's like, well, there's a 3rd tree, and there's a 3rd row, there's a 3rd gate, there's a 3rd whatever. He's doing this on purpose to help identify you into one or the other. One or the other. So you'll see that as we go through and we keep going. And then the last one, the language of the blessed, like I had mentioned, the idea of the blessed through the whole thing. He was blessing the people and telling them, blessed are you, instead of them blessing him, because he was God. Baruch was the Hebrew word for blessed, blessing. And they were God was now blessing his people, instead of them saying, blessed and glory all be to you, our God. Instead, he says, blessed are you. So, those are things just to keep in mind. The last thing that I have to talk about before we actually really jump in is the idea of what first century discipleship really looked like. So in ancient Israel at that time, discipleship looked a lot different than what we do. Typically, around the age of about 6 to 7 years old, you would start studying under a rabbi. You would go to a rabbi or a teacher, who maybe equate this to maybe a pastor or a staff member at our church, and you would study under them, and you would learn from them. But the difference was it wasn't just knowledge acquisition. You weren't just learning stuff. Your ideal discipleship from a rabbi would be that you would actually take on the character of your rabbi, the character of the person who's mentoring you, not just what they know, but how they love, how they care, how they conduct themselves in public spaces. Everything was focused on being able to become like the rabbi. Now, this is really key because, again, the disciples were just called. These disciples were already working jobs and doing things like fishing, tax collecting, etc., which means that they were not selected to be under a rabbi at this point. They either didn't make the mark, they didn't cut it, or they didn't want to be a part of it. I like to think they weren't quite cut out to be underneath a rabbi. The rabbis were like, you're not qualified enough. And Jesus goes to the most unqualified, unlearned, unteached people and says, I want you to be my disciples. Follow me. Your whole life underneath a disciple would be eating together, walking around together, visiting people. You would go and do purification. You would go to the temple and talk with the priests. You would basically be doing everything together. So imagine an entire life for 10 years spent underneath a rabbi or underneath the staff member or a pastor learning to be like them. That's what first century discipleship looked like. You were in close, tight-knit relationships with your leaders, with the people that were put over you. This was the context of first century discipleship, which will be so key as we talk about why this passage is referring to discipleship and why he's talking to the disciples. Because again, if you think about this, I'll kind of give a spoiler alert. If Jesus is posturing himself as a rabbi, and he has just called people to be there, and if you want to take on the character of your rabbi, what character traits are the disciples going to eventually take on? It's going to be Jesus, right? If Jesus is their rabbi, and he's asking them to spend time with him, to follow him, to learn everything about him, to demonstrate the character that he has, he's telling his disciples, hey, there's a lot of rabbis out there, but I'm the Son of God. Follow me. Those disciples will eventually take on the characteristics of that rabbi. Right? We'll see how that plays out. Now, here we go. Sermon. Ending. Somebody want to read this? Or I guess I'm reading. You're just tired. You're just like, no, read it. No, I can read it. It's fine. No, it's twice. I'm going to read it. Okay. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction. Many enter through it, but small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life. Only few who find it. So, one thing to know, narrow roads. In the ancient world, narrow roads were typically ones that were not well traveled, and they went to small gates or a part of small cities. Small cities were not well fortified, did not have lots of resources, and were really prone to attacks. The roads were probably lined with pirates, think land pirates. Think like Pirates of the Caribbean, but with so much less water. That's what you can imagine on these smaller roads. The wider roads were typically more traveled because there was trade. They were leading to bigger cities, more fortification. They had more resources. They were protected. They were safe. They were comfortable. And Jesus is basically saying, I want you to enter through the narrow gate. I want you to be dangerous. I want you to get uncomfortable. Following me is going to be difficult. It's not easy. Only a few people find this. It's not easy. It's difficult. You will be prone to attacks. We've already seen this. People will insult you because of your righteousness. People will insult you because you follow Christ. You will be persecuted. And she's saying, I'm not trying to paint a picture that makes it perfect. It's difficult. And this narrow road, as difficult as it may be, this difficult road leads to life. It leads to life. The wide road that's broadly traveled, that's comfortable and easy and roomy, and gets you in where you want to go and makes you comfortable, that's the one that leads ultimately to destruction. That's the one that does not lead to life. You have been called to life and life in the full in me. Follow me. Jesus in another place is going to talk about how he is the gate and all sorts of other analogies that he draws on. It's the same word. But basically the idea here is that Jesus is not just calling us to make a one-time decision and then we can just forget everything. He says, walk the whole path, walk the whole gate. It leads to life. Walk, keep going. It's difficult. I promise you, follow me. It leads to life. Well, one of the commentators that I read in a sermon about this passage said that we have comfortable souls but wasted lives. We have comfortable souls. We love being comfy on the wide road, going to the big city through the wide gate. It feels really comfortable. But then we have completely wasted lives because we've lacked the initiative on our end to actually risk ourselves for the gospel, to be radical, to take on the character of Jesus. He is our example. But when we see and say, but if he suffered, why should I suffer? I should have all the comfort. I should be fine. I should be okay. And he calls us to more. So that's that one. I'm going to keep going. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down, is thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them. So, why would Jesus be concerned about false prophets? And again, if we go back to the definition that we talked about, an idea of prophet is just somebody who speaks on authority on behalf of God. Right? Moses could categorically be a prophet. He's the one who stands between God and his people and says, thus says the Lord. Right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, all of your prophets, thus says the Lord. They're basically taking what God says and his ethics and character and his scriptures and then communicates it to the people and says, here is what God thinks. Here is what God says. And Jesus is saying, watch out for false prophets. Right? They come to you in sheep's clothing, inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Now, the question that we would want to know is, well, then who would be a false teacher? Like, who would that be? Can we get a category for that? What he says is, by their fruit you will recognize them. The times that Jesus has used fruit, he's not describing ministry. He's not describing primarily, although sometimes he does talk about this, it's not talking about theology or doctrine. He's talking about lifestyle. He's saying, watch their lifestyle. Is what they're teaching and what they're preaching and how they're doing their life, is all of that correlated together? If they say, go and love your spouse, or go and love your friend, be merciful, forgive, but then they themselves don't forgive, you will see that fruit in their life. You'll see that. They might preach, I have authority from God, and I tell you to do this, but then they're not willing to do the exact same thing. They're not practicing what they're preaching. In our mind, Jesus has just given us a test to be able to figure out, well, who's a false teacher? Who's a false prophet in our day? And Jesus says there's one really good test. There's other tests, and he's going to talk about that later in the book of Matthew. But one of the tests he gives us, look at their lifestyle. Look at what they believe and how it eventually will form into fruit. Because again, when you plant a tree, you have no idea whether it's going to have good fruit or bad fruit, can you? You can't really tell. Until the fruit actually bears off of the tree, and the tree grows into its fullness, then you can actually see and taste the fruit and say, is this good? Is this not? And Jesus is equating lifestyle with fruit. So this idea, watch out for false teachers, watch out for false prophets, those who assume God's authority, but then in their lives they're being inconsistent. Now what he's not saying is that we have to be perfect then. Everyone needs to be perfect. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, watch for people who are radically inconsistent with what they preach and what they do. These people who say, no, God has chosen me, but still then abuse people, oppress people, do not give mercy, who do not accord themselves with Jesus Christ, those are the ones who are the false prophets. Another important point to be reminded about this is that, again, the rabbinic structure of discipleship, disciples who believe if they're ready to be a rabbi and lead without finishing their training, ultimately would then have the possibility, the opportunity to assume that they had made it and then to leave the discipleship training early. Because typically it took about 10 years for you to finally be at a point where they would lay their hands and commission you and say, all right, underneath my rabbi authority, underneath the authority of this synagogue, I now say you are a rabbi, you are a leader, you may go and you may love and minister to the people of God. But there were some rabbis that wanted, there were some disciples that wanted to leave early and say, I've been here for 2-3 years, I'm good. I want to be out. I want to go and do everything on my own. I don't want to spend more time taking on your character and your teaching and learning how things work. I think I got this figured out. Let me go and do it. And Jesus is saying, like, be careful of those people who leave early and don't have their character and their knowledge formed together. That's cumulatively what is a false teacher, a false prophet. Their lifestyle does matter. It must be consistent with their teaching. And it basically becomes a warning for the disciples themselves, because then we have this passage. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Now, I think this is one of the most terrifying texts in the whole passage, and so when I read this, I was like, why? I don't want to talk about this. But we have to talk about it because it's in the Bible. So, here it is. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. The idea here is that when you say something twice like that, it basically is affirming a proximity or a closeness, right? Paul's going to say in his letters, Abba, Father. If you look at the Aramaic in there, it's literally just Abba, Abba. Daddy, Daddy. Father, Father. It's denoting proximity. And Jesus is saying these people are coming to them saying, Jesus, Jesus, Lord, Lord, like you are my everything, you are my everything. Did we not prophesy? Did we not do all this ministry for you? We did all of these great ministry things. But look at what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't dismiss what they did. He dismisses their assumed proximity to Jesus. He doesn't say that their works were in vain. He says, no, your soul's the one that's in vain. Again, look at what he says too. He doesn't say, you never knew me, I never knew you. Think first century discipleship. If you spend 10 years with a rabbi, is your rabbi going to know who you are? 10 years, every single day. You can do the math. Was it like 3,000 days together? Your rabbi eventually knows who you are. They know your character. They know what you teach. They know what you preach. They know your weaknesses and your strength. They know everything about you. So this is not well, we have to get to know Jesus and we have to know him. No, does he know you? Paul uses this in Galatians and 1 Corinthians, right? He says all the time, he's like, not that I know God, but that he knows me. God knows him. He understood the structure of discipleship in the first century. Does God know you? Now, one of the things about this is that this created so much anxiety for me. I was like, okay, well, what if I'm the one who goes to Jesus and says, Lord, Lord, like, didn't I do all these things for you? Don't you know me? He goes, no, away from me. I'm like, what? So, there has to be some level where we start to say, well, is there hope? How do we get a good idea of what we, as the people of God, are supposed to know? Give us a category. Help us figure this out. If Jesus really is saying, if I don't know you, then you're not into the kingdom, then what do? We build houses. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, and beat against the house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, beat against the house, and fell with a great crash. Does anybody know what a wadi is? No? Middle East? No? Yes? Peter's like, yeah, I know. Wadis basically were canyons in desert areas that were really close to mountains. And typically, on any given day, if you were in one of these canyons, there wouldn't be any water at the bottom of the canyon. But then when there was rain at the top of the mountain, wherever it was close to, the rain wouldn't necessarily swoop down and you have this nice little trickling stream near still waters and green pastures. There wouldn't be anything there. It would only be within a matter of about 30 minutes after the rain had fallen where you would get a complete flash flood all the way through the canyon. And Jesus is basically pulling on this analogy. If this is where you build your house, you build it on the sand. On the bottom of this canyon, when it rains and the wind blows, your house will be completely destroyed. Again, Jesus is using twos. He's already given us 2 gates, 2 trees, 2 fruits. Now he's saying there's a rock to build your life on, and there's sand to build your life on. The sand, building your life on this, is moving away from discipleship with me. Moving away from me saying, no, Jesus, there's life and it's outside of you. I want to go and find life that's not in you, not with you, not always together with you. He's saying, that life is building your house on a canyon where there will be a flash flood. It will not work. It will come down. But, he says, if you build this on the rock, not on the sand, you're like a wise person. This wise language is pulling off of Psalms. Wise is the one who sits and meditates on the law of the Lord, who delights in the fear of the Lord. The person who looks and says, I want to be like you. I want to love like you, serve like you. I want to be yours. Help me be like you. And Jesus says that's the essence of discipleship. Come and spend time with me. Sit at my feet. Learn from me. Not just knowledge. Learn character. How did I love people? How did I serve people? How did I give myself up, especially on the cross, to love all of humanity, to die and resurrect and prove to us that he is truly worthy of being followed, not just as a rabbi, not just as a prophet, but King and Lord of the entire universe, and who will come again and resurrect us like he is resurrected. That's ultimately what we have to look forward to. Following Jesus, being like him. And Jesus says, this is wise. You're exercising biblical wisdom. Follow me. Follow me. So ultimately, when we get to the end of the Beatitudes, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, okay, that's fine. But isn't this just asking us to do a bunch of stuff to make sure that we're saved? Isn't this just making sure that we have to do and exercise and perform and earn our salvation in all these ways, and then we're really in? And I think that's a plain reading and a misreading of the text. I think another misreading of the text is to look at this and go, you know what, none of this really matters. Ultimately, Jesus died on the cross. We can ignore the entire Sermon on the Mount. We can ignore the Beatitudes. We don't have to worry about it because grace, love, we don't need to look at any of these things. Instead, I think it's more of an in-between, one of both, actually. I think it actually pushes us to say, yes, our God is a loving, gracious Father, and he has died and he has rose again so we might have true life in him. And at the same time, he's calling us, don't stop there. Keep following me. Keep pressing into me. Love, serve, give yourself over. Be in such close proximity with me that my character begins to transform you. This is the doctrine of progressive sanctification. This is what it means to become more Christ-like, spending time with him. Yes, we have grace, and yes, he will cover our faults. And yes, we will sin boldly and gravely and hurt people. But the grace of Christ is enough to say, spend more time with me. Follow me. It's not over. You're not cast out. Spend time with me. Let Rabbi Jesus know who you are. Let Jesus, the Lord of the universe, know who you are. Spend time with him. Tell him. Be the wise person who builds a foundation not on sand, not on your own understanding. Don't leave your discipleship with Jesus early. Stick around. Come stay a while. Come home. Build your home with him. I think ultimately that's where we want to land. I don't think that the Sermon on the Mount is trying to tell us we need to be super religious or super Christians or embrace some weird, special understanding of Christianity. I think it's simply just asking us, will you follow Jesus? Will you follow him? Will you build your life on him, the rock, the solid foundation? Will you spend time with him so you take on who he is? So that our hearts would turn and reshape and be more like him. So we get to the end. I'm going to wrap this up so we can get to questions and we can stay on track. So at the end, the disciples had now become the crowds. If you notice, and Brian had pointed this out to me, Brian Freeman, if you read through at the beginning, Jesus calls the disciples, and it's just the disciples who are at the mountain. By the time the sermon ends, it's now the crowds. It's the same word used every time when the crowds were the multitudes that were following him. People came and began to listen to what Jesus had to say. I think it's a really important thing to say. Just being a part of the crowd and just following the crowd is not enough. Still, building your life and following Jesus is the most important part of this. It's not just being a part of the crowds or going where other people are. It's being in with Jesus, following him and loving him. Secondly, they were amazed. I did a super fast word study on this. The word amazed could translate like this: struck from within, laid desolate with awe, tremble with astonishment. And maybe that's a good application for us right now. Even just a theoretical question to just ask. At the end of the sermon, if the crowds and the disciples were amazed, if they were struck from within, when we read this and Jesus says, follow me, spend time with me, worship me, serve me, are we struck from within? Are we struck? Are we laid desolate? Are we trembling, saying, I want to follow you? Do we want that? And then lastly, authority, not like the teachers of the law. The authority comes because he is God himself. Not just someone regurgitating everything that's already been said, but someone who comes with true authority, the true sovereign interpretation of the scriptures, the one who defines the judgments like Nolan had talked about. This is our God, and he's the one who ultimately has authority in our lives. And he's calling every single one of us to have a relationship with him. So it's not just the super Christians. It's not just the ones who think that, well, I'm less than, I'm not going to be welcomed, I mess up a lot. It's like every single person is made in the image of God, which means every single person can be remade into the image of Christ. And that's the point, that's the goal. Fill the earth with his glory. That offer is still standing today. So here's the question. I answered it, but I want you to talk about it in your group time too. Jesus is creating a new people through intimate relationship. One defined by fruitfulness through faithfulness. One defined by wisdom and practicing the ethic of love. And Jesus is the one who defines what that looks like. Life is before us as God's people to take Jesus' words to heart and to do what he invites us to partake in, which is to follow him and to love others. Love God and love others. Now, this is it. Last thing I'm going to say. I said this before, but you will not remember my talk. You just won't. I've heard enough sermons. You've heard enough sermons. You're not going to remember my talk. You're not going to remember things I said. You're not going to remember anything about that. And that's totally fine. I'm okay with that. I think what I do want to press on, though, is not how memorable I was or how memorable any of the content was or what you learned about Wadis or first century discipleship. I don't care about that. Ultimately, what matters most is I want you to consider the question and the offer that Jesus has before you of following him. Putting those two things, again, two gates, two trees, and he's saying, like, it doesn't stop there. I'm telling you, follow me, and life is at hand. Life and death are before you, so choose life. Follow me. If you get nothing else when you walk out of this retreat, you go back to Minneapolis, St. Paul, you leave here, go into your discussions, talk about what does it mean to follow Jesus, and to give yourself to him, and to sit under his grace and his love and his mercy in your life today, not tomorrow, right now. What does that look like? Again, forget everything I told you. Don't remember my talk, but follow Jesus. And that's the ultimate question, the ultimate decision that matters when you leave here and you go back, and we go back into serving our church community at home. That's ultimately what matters, follow him. So take time. You have until 10:25, and then we'll have brunch at 10:30. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your retreat.